Two cowboys leaned against the counter at the mercantile, watching her come through the door. One of them set down his coffee and said it loud enough for the whole store to hear. "There she is, the woman building a coffin out of kindling." Out in Elk Coulee, the thing they were laughing at was rising between her cabin and her barn, two walls of stacked firewood, 8 feet high and growing, with a dark corridor between them just wide enough for a woman carrying a milk pail. It looked like nothing anyone had seen before. It looked, from the ridge road, like something a person builds when grief has replaced good sense. She heard what they called it. She went home, picked up the fro, and kept splitting. Ragna Brecka had been a widow for 11 days when the first hard frost came to Elk Coulee. She stood at the cabin door that October morning in 1887 and watched ice form on the water bucket before she could carry it inside. The cabin was 16 feet by 20, built from green cottonwood that Pater had notched in August and never chinked properly because he had been raising the barn first. The logic had been sound in summer. The cattle needed shelter before the people did. Pater had said they would finish the house walls in September, seal them in October, and spend November stacking wood. He had said this while standing on a cut bank above the Judith Basin Road, guiding a wagon team loaded with green cottonwood logs. The team spooked. The wagon rolled. They found Pater under the load with his chest crushed and his eyes open, and Ragna became the sole owner of 14 milk cows, 2 calves, 1 heifer, a half-finished cabin, a better-built barn, and a store account already marked in red at Cresswell's Mercantile, 17 miles toward Utica. She could not leave. The cows were collateral against Pater's debt. The homestead claim was in final proof, which meant abandoning it would forfeit everything: the land, the improvements, the year of labor Pater had poured into the barn's timber frame. The nearest relatives were in Telemark, across an ocean she could not afford to cross, even if she had been willing to arrive empty-handed. As a widow, the law allowed her to hold the claim. The law said nothing about whether the coolie would allow her to survive it. $27.60. That was what remained in the coffee tin behind the flour sacks. 3 sacks of flour, a half side of salt pork already going rancid at the edges, a cracked lantern that leaked kerosene if tilted past upright, and 1 stove, a squat cast-iron box that Pater had bought second-hand from a railroad worker in Fort Benton. The stove worked. Everything else was short. The ranch itself was workable in fair weather. The cabin sat 40 feet from the barn. In October, that distance meant a brisk walk with a milk pail, boots crunching on frozen grass, breath visible but harmless. In a whiteout, the kind that came sideways off the plains and turned 40 feet into 400 anyway, that distance became a death strip. No rope held steady in a 60-mile wind. No lantern stayed lit in horizontal snow. Ragna had to cross that gap at least twice daily: morning milking, evening feeding, ice breaking in the stock trough, checking the calving stalls where the heifer would drop sometime in late winter. Miss 1 crossing, and the cattle went without water. Miss 2 and the milk froze in the udders. Miss the wrong one and Ragna froze between buildings, 40 feet from warmth in either direction. She knew this because she had watched it happen. Not here, not yet, but in Norway and again on the plains. People did not die of cold in the wilderness. They died of cold between the house and the barn. 11 days after the funeral, Bernd Assen came. He arrived on a dun horse with a walking stick strapped to his saddle, 62 years old, a former trail boss and road commissioner who had wintered in Montana since before the territory had a name anyone east of the Missouri would recognize. He did not come to offer help. He came to assess damage, the way a man walks a riverbank after a flood. Not to rebuild, but to measure what was lost. Bernd dismounted, tied his horse to the fence post Pater had set but never braced, and walked the property with the stick tapping frozen ground. He did not knock on the cabin door. He went to the barn first, circled it, tested the north eave with his hand, looked at the gap where wind sang through the unfinished chinking, and then paced the distance between barn and cabin. 40 feet. He counted the steps aloud. Then he turned and looked at the open ground between the 2 buildings. Flat, exposed, with nothing to break the wind from the north or the northwest, where the worst storms came. Ragna met him at the barn door. She had been mucking the east stall, and her boots were black to the ankle. She did not invite him inside. Bernd leaned on his stick and looked at her the way men looked at arithmetic they did not enjoy. "Your husband built a good barn," he said. "Better than most, but he built it 40 feet from the house with nothing between, and now he is not here to cross that distance for you." Ragna said nothing. Bernd pointed the stick at the cabin. "That house is not sealed. You have gaps in the north wall I can see daylight through from here. The chinking is green and it will shrink. By December, the wind will come through that wall like it is not there." "I know," Ragna said. "Do you know what 6 cords of firewood looks like stacked against a kitchen wall?" "I know what 20 cords looks like," Ragna said. "My husband died hauling it." Bernd paused. He had not expected that number. 20 cords was more than most operations stored in a season. He recovered by tapping the stick against the nearest fence post, which wobbled. 20 cords does not fix a drafty house," he said. 20 cords does not give you a hired man sleeping by the stock in a blow. 20 cords does not change the fact that you are one woman with 14 head and a 40-foot walk that will kill you in January. He paced the distance again, this time facing north, squinting into the wind that was already sharp enough to water his eyes. 40 feet in clear weather," Bernd said. 400 in a blow. You need either hired hands or a dugout beside the barn. Move the stove, sleep with the cattle, sell half the herd, and maybe you see spring." He turned to face her. "A woman alone on this ground needs to subtract, not add." Ragna's jaw tightened. She could feel the truth in his words the way she could feel the wind through the cabin wall, constant, invasive, and impossible to argue with by simply standing still. "And if I will not sell?" she asked. Bernd shrugged. "Then Cresswell will sell for you. He holds the note. You miss payment before Christmas, he takes first right on the herd. After that, the claim is just dirt with a leaky house on it." He mounted his horse, touched the brim of his hat, and rode out of the coolie without looking back. The walking stick swayed against the saddle like a pendulum, counting down something Ragna could not yet name. She stood at the barn door and watched him go. 14 cows shifted behind her, their breath warm and sour in the cold stall. The heifer stamped. One of the calves bleated. 40 feet away, the cabin sat with its door hanging slightly open because the latch Pater had carved no longer caught. 20 cords of firewood lay in a rough pile between the buildings, dumped where the wagon had been unloaded before the accident. Some pieces were split, most were not. Green cottonwood, dry pine, a few ash rounds heavy enough to anchor a fence. It was fuel for an entire winter. If the winter cooperated, if the house held heat, if the stove drew properly, if the wood stayed dry, if she could reach it in a storm, and if she did not die crossing 40 feet of open ground to feed the cattle that were the only thing standing between her and Harvey Cresswell's account book. The math was simple and brutal. If she stacked the wood by the cabin, the house stayed warm, but the cattle might die because she could not reach them in a blizzard. If she stacked it by the barn, the cattle stayed fed, but the house went cold, and she burned through her reserves hauling armloads across open ground. If she split the pile, some here, some there, she had half measures in both places, and a full death strip in between. No conventional arrangement solved all 3 problems: warm house, accessible fuel, safe passage to the stock. Ragna went inside, sat at the plank table Pater had built from scrap pine, and looked at the wall where the north wind pushed a visible current of cold air through gaps in the chinking. She could feel it on her face from 4 feet away. The stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, the sky was the color of hammered tin, and the wind was building. She had until January, maybe less. The idea did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as anger. 3 days after Bernt's visit, the first November squall came hard across the coulee. Not a blizzard, not yet, but a preview. Wind at 30 miles an hour with snow like grit, the kind that did not fall but flew, horizontal and sharp enough to sting exposed skin raw. Ragna tried the rope method. Every frontier manual recommended it. Tie a hemp line from cabin latch to barn post. Follow the rope in a blow. Simple. Proven. The method that experienced people like Bernd Assen would call common sense. She tied the rope at dawn, knotted it twice at each end, and waited for the squall to thicken. By mid-morning, the wind was steady enough to test. She took the milk pail in her left hand, grabbed the rope with her right, and stepped out. The first 10 feet were manageable. The wind hit her broadside, and she leaned into it the way a person leans into a current, controlled, braced, moving. The rope vibrated under her glove like a living thing. At 20 feet, the pail caught the wind. It swung wide, banged her shin hard enough to buckle her knee, and jerked the rope through her grip. The hemp tore skin from her palm in a stripe that burned hotter than the cold. Snow filled her eyes. She could not see the barn. She could not see the cabin behind her. She could see the rope, barely, and she followed it hand over hand like a woman pulling herself from a water. She reached the barn door gasping, furious, bleeding into her glove, with an empty milk pail and a conviction that the rope method was a lie told by people who had never used it in real wind. Inside the barn, she pressed her back against the stall partition and caught her breath. The cows watched her with the flat patience of animals who did not understand what 40 feet of open ground meant to a person who weighed 130 pounds and could be knocked sideways by a gust. That was when she noticed it. The haystack along the east wall had been there since September, loose hay piled against the barn boards as insulation. Snow had been curling around the barn all morning, drifting against every surface the wind could reach. But behind the haystack, the ground was dry. The air was still. The wind hit the hay, rose over it, or split around it, and left a pocket of calm in its wake. Ragna pushed off the stall partition and walked to the haystack. She put her hand in the dead air behind it. Calm, cold, but calm. No grit snow, no horizontal bite, just still air and dry ground. Then she looked at the cord wood pile visible through the open barn door. Pater's 20 cords, dumped in a rough heap, some pieces scattered by wind, others already half buried in drift. Where the pile was dense, where logs lay tight against each other with no gaps, the snow on the leeward side was smooth, undisturbed, settled. Where the pile was loose, where gaps opened between rounds, the wind whistled through and the snow on the far side was scoured and restless. Tight wood stopped wind, loose wood let it pass. She stood in the barn door, bleeding hand wrapped in her apron, and looked at the 40 feet between buildings, the distance that would kill her. The open ground that Bernd had measured with his stick and declared impassable in a blow. Then the memory came. Not a decision, a memory. Her father, Oddmund Brecke, in Telemark. She had been 8 or 9, standing beside him in the woodyard behind their house, while winter settled over the valley. He had stacked the year's firewood against the north wall of the house, not inside, not under a roof, but against the wall itself, tight as masonry, 4 feet thick and higher than her head. She had asked why the wood lived outside instead of inside where it would be dry. Her father had taken her hand and pressed her palm flat against the leeward side of the stacked wood. "Feel," he had said. She felt. The wall was cold, but the air beside it was not. The wind that raked the valley floor and drove snow against every exposed surface did not reach the space behind the woodpile. The wood absorbed it, scattered it, broke it into nothing. "The fire begins before the stove," her father had said. "If the wind cannot reach the house is already winning." Ragna stood in the barn door in Elk Coulee, 31 years old, bleeding, furious, and remembering the weight of her father's hand pressing hers against stacked spruce in Telemark. The wood did not have to wait to become useful until it burned. It could earn its keep all winter, not as a pile, not as a stack against one wall, as a structure, as walls, as a passage between the 2 buildings that would stop wind, catch drift, block the killing exposure of open ground, and still serve as fuel burned in sequence, 1 armload at a time, from the inside faces only, so the outer faces remained wind armor as long as possible. She went to the barn floor, found a piece of charcoal from the farrier's bucket, and knelt on the packed earth. 20 cords, 2,560 cubic feet. She scratched the numbers into the floor, working the math the way her father had worked timber estimates. Not with paper, but with dimensions held in the hands. 2 walls, each 40 feet long, 8 feet high, 4 feet thick. 40 times 8 times 4 equaled 1,280 cubic feet per wall. 2 walls, 2,560. The full 20 cords, exactly. Nothing left over. Nothing wasted. 4 feet of space between the walls, enough to walk with a milk pail, enough to carry hay flakes, enough to breathe. The passage would run from the cabin door to the barn door, a covered corridor walled entirely in firewood, capped with scrap tin and poles to shed snow from the top. She would burn from the inside faces only, 1 armload at a time. The outer faces would remain solid, dense, unbroken, wind armor that lasted as long as the winter lasted. By spring, the inner walls would be thinner, but the outer walls would still stand. She would consume her own shelter from the inside, carefully, the way a candle burns down its own body without collapsing until the very end. The risk was enormous. If the tin cap leaked, the wood would mold or freeze together into a solid mass she could not split. If the walls leaned inward, they could collapse in the passage while she was inside. If the corridor trapped drifting snow instead of shedding it, she would build herself a tomb. If she burned too much from one side, the windbreak would open before March, and the last months of winter would find her exposed again with half her fuel gone. Ragna stared at the charcoal numbers on the barn floor. The math worked. The physics worked. She had felt the proof against her palm, first in telemark and again behind the haystack 10 minutes ago. The design worked if the execution was exact. If. She heard her father's voice, or imagined she did. The fire begins before the stove. She stood up, wrapped her bleeding hand tighter, and walked to the woodpile. Marit Hoagland came the next afternoon, walking the mile from her own claim with a jar of rendered lard and a question she had been carrying since the funeral. Marit was 29, sharp-featured, with 2 children under 6, and a husband named Leif, who hauled freight between Utica and Fort Benton and was gone more often than present. She was not hostile. She was frightened, not of Ragna, but of what Ragna's failure would prove about every woman left alone on the plains when the weather turned. She found Ragna sorting wood. The 20 cords lay spread across the ground between cabin and barn, and Ragna was on her knees among the logs, separating cottonwood from pine, heavy from light, straight from crooked. She had chalk marks on her sleeves and charcoal on her face. "What are you doing?" Marit asked. Ragna explained. 2 walls, 40 feet, a covered passage, fuel that serves as structure before it serves as heat. Marit listened with her arms crossed against the wind. When Ragna finished, Marit set the lard jar on a stump and said what she had come to say. "Wood belongs near a stove, not standing out like a fence. You're putting your entire winter supply where snow can reach it, where wind can loosen it, where every wet spell will rot the bottom courses. If you stack it wrong, you lose the fuel and the wall." "The stove loses if the wind wins first," Ragna said. Marit frowned. "You sound like your father." "My father kept his family warm for 40 winters." "Your father was not alone in Montana with 14 cows and a dead husband." The words landed harder than Marit intended. Ragna's hands stopped moving on the logs. For a moment, the 2 women looked at each other across the scattered wood, and the wind filled the silence between them with the sound of something neither could name. "I am not building a fence," Ragna said quietly. "I am building a passage. If it works, I can reach the cattle in any storm. If it works, the wind never hits the cabin wall directly. If it works, the wood earns its keep twice, once as armor, once as fuel. And if it does not work," Ragna picked up a split pine log, measured it against the one beside it, and set them both in the pile she had marked for the lower courses. "Then Cresswell gets the cows," she said, "and everyone in this coolie can say they were right." Marit left the lard and walked home. She did not say goodbye, and she did not say she believed. At Cresswell's store, the idea arrived before Ragna did. Cowboys from the Hackett outfit, riding the bench road above Elk Coulee, had seen the wood sorting from the ridge. By the time Ragna walked into the store 4 days later to buy 6 pounds of cut nails, used hinges, and a bundle of rejected tin sheeting, the story had already been told, retold, and improved upon by men who had never stacked a cord in their lives. She heard it before she saw who was talking. Two men leaning against the counter, coffee cups in hand, watching her come through the door the way spectators watch a horse they have already bet against. "There she is," one of them said. "The woman building a coffin out of kindling." The other laughed. "Heard she is walling up the whole yard. Says she will walk to the barn inside a woodpile. First wet snow rots every stick." Ragna set her list on the counter and waited for Cresswell. Harvey Cresswell was 46, narrow-shouldered and precise in the way that storekeepers are precise. Every number exact, every debt remembered, every weakness cataloged for future use. He did not laugh at the cowboy's joke. He smiled. It was worse than laughter because it meant he was calculating. He filled her order slowly. 6 pounds of cut nails, a bundle of used hinges, 4 sheets of rejected tin, the sheets with dents and bent edges that no one else would buy. He wrote each item in the ledger with the careful hand of a man who knew exactly what the total meant. $22.40, he said, which brings your account to $68.90 outstanding. Payment before Christmas, as agreed. As Peter agreed, Ragna said. As the account holder agreed. The account holder is now you. He set his pen down and leaned forward. His voice dropped to the register men use when they believe they are being kind. "I will make this simple. Sign an agreement giving me first right to buy the cattle at fair price if you miss the December payment. No penalty, no interest, just a clean transfer. The cows are worth more than the debt. You would walk away clear." "I would walk away with nothing." "You would walk away alive. No shame in admitting winter is bigger than pride, Ragna." She took the nails, the hinges, and the tin. She left without coffee, kerosene, or salt pork, items she needed but could not afford once the nails and tin were added. Cresswell watched her go and made a note in the margin of the ledger. She could not see what he wrote, but she could guess. Outside, one of the cowboys called after her. "Hope that kindling coffin has a lid. You are going to need it." Ragna loaded the tin onto the mule and started the 17-mile ride home. The community judgment spread the way things spread in a country with few people in long winters, slowly, thoroughly, and with the weight of consensus. Children along the Judith Basin Road began calling the unfinished passage Brecka's Tunnel. A rider Ragna did not recognize stopped at the road above her, claimed to stare at the sordid wood piles, then rode on without speaking. Someone, she never learned who, left a broken stove lid by her gate, propped against the fence post like a headstone. The message was clear. She was burning her own grave. Merritt came back 3 days later, not with lard this time, but with a warning. She stood at the edge of the sorting ground and spoke quickly, as if delivering news she did not want to carry. "People are saying you have lost your mind with grief, that you are wasting good fuel on a wall that will fall in the first real wind. Cresswell told the freight driver you would not last until Christmas." She paused. "I am telling you this because it is getting worse, not better. They are not just laughing, they are turning. A woman who fails out here proves what they already believe, that a woman can inherit a ranch but not run one." Ragna was splitting pine with a froe and wedge, working the blade into a round that was too crooked to stack whole. She did not stop. "Let them turn," she said. "You do not understand. If they turn far enough, no one helps. No one trades. No one comes when you need a hand with a calf or a broken axle. You become alone in a way that has nothing to do with weather." Ragna brought the wedge down and the round split clean. She set the two halves in the pile for the lower courses. Her hands were cracked at the knuckles. The cut on her palm from the rope was healing, but the skin was tight and pink, and it pulled every time she closed her fist. "I was alone the moment Peter died," Ragna said. "The weather just has not proved it yet." Marit left again. This time she looked back once from the road. Bernd Ossen returned on a Thursday, unannounced, with his stick and his arithmetic. He found the first wall at 20 feet high, 10 courses high, 4 feet thick, the logs alternating butt and tip the way Ragna had figured out by trial on the third day. She had started with all butts facing one direction and found the wall leaning inward from the taper. Alternating them leveled the courses. It was not elegant. Some pieces fit poorly. Gaps showed where crooked rounds refused to lie flat. Burnt walked the length of the first wall, tapping his stick against the face every few feet. At the 8th course, he stopped. Without warning, he hooked the end of his stick behind a log and pulled. The log slid out. The one above it shifted. 2 courses above that, a round rolled forward and hit the ground with a sound like a mallet striking frozen earth. Ragna's face went hot. She had been carrying a split pine to the south wall, and she stopped mid-stride, the log braced against her hip, and watched Burnt knock her work apart the way a man kicks a dog's shelter to prove it will not stand. "This is not a windbreak," Burnt said. "This is a pile with ambition. A proper windbreak is planted in trees, not made of fuel. You have no corner locks. You have no drainage pitch. You have round logs stacked on round logs, and the first settling frost will shift every course above the 4th. He pointed the stick at the gap he had created. "The wind will find this. The wind finds everything." Ragna set the log down. Her shoulders ached. Her wrist had been swelling since yesterday. The left one, the one she braced against when driving the fro. She could feel the anger building behind her teeth, but she held it there because Burnt was partly right. The wall was not good enough. She could see that now, standing where he stood, looking at the gap he had opened with nothing more than a walking stick and 62 years of knowing what wind did to things that were not built correctly. "Then show me what I am doing wrong," she said. Burnt stared at her. He had not expected the request. He had come to deliver a verdict, not a lesson. "I am not a wall builder," he said. "You just built a hole in mine. That makes you qualified." He almost smiled. She saw it. A flicker at the corner of his mouth, gone as fast as it appeared. Then he shook his head, mounted his horse, and rode out of the coolie the same way he had the first time. But this time he looked back. Ragna spent the rest of the day restacking the knocked-out section. She alternated butts and tips more carefully, pressing each log against the one below it before adding the next. She tested every course by pushing against it with her hip. When it held, she moved to the next. When it shifted, she pulled it and started again. By evening, the repaired section was tighter than the original. She could see the difference. The logs lay closer together. The gaps were smaller. The face was flatter. But the wall was still only 20 feet long and 10 courses high. It needed to be 40 feet long and 20 courses high. She had rebuilt 6 feet of it in an entire day. She went inside, ate cold flour paste because she did not want to waste wood heating the stove for one meal, and sat at the table looking at her swollen wrist. 18 days until December. The north wall was at 20 feet. The south wall had not been started. The tin cap existed only as 4 dented sheets leaning against the barn, and the temperature had dropped 8 degrees since Monday. She flexed her hand. The wrist burned. She flexed it again. Outside, the wind found the gap in the cabin's north wall and pushed cold air across the floor in a current she could see in the dust. The 20 cords waited in the dark between the buildings, unsorted, unstacked, and earning nothing. Marte Lunde arrived on a Tuesday, driving a 2-mule wagon with a broken tailgate chain and a list of things she needed that did not include pity. She was 58 years old, Norwegian-born, built like a fence post, narrow, hard, vertical. She had cooked for a Northern Pacific Railroad section camp for 6 years, stacked hay for 3 ranches along the Musselshell, and measured cordwood for a fuel contractor who sold to the Army post at Fort McGinnis. She knew what a cord looked like the way most people knew what a face looked like, without needing to measure. She had buried a husband in 79 and a brother in 83, and she did not talk about either unless the conversation required it. She came to buy milk. Ragna was one of the few in the Judith Basin who kept milking through October, and Marte needed cream for a standing order she filled in Utica. She pulled the wagon into the yard, set the brake, and walked toward the barn with a tin pail in each hand. She stopped when she saw the south wall. Ragna was on her knees beside the second course, rejecting a crooked cottonwood round. The round was heavy, dry, and would have filled a gap if forced into place. Ragna turned it in her hands, tested it against the course below, felt it rock on the uneven face, and set it aside. She reached for a straighter piece, lighter, green but flat on two sides, and pressed it into the gap instead. Marte watched this for a full minute. She set the pails down on the frozen ground and walked to the wall. "You are stacking like someone who expects the wind to read your mistakes," she said. Ragna looked up. She did not know this woman. She saw the wagon, the mules, the pails, and the posture of a person who had worked outdoors long enough to stop noticing cold. "The wind does read mistakes," Ragna said. Marte nodded. It was not agreement. It was recognition. She had heard the right answer from someone she had not expected to give it. "How high are you going?" Marte asked. 8 feet? On both sides?" "Both sides, 40 feet long, 4 feet thick each, tin cap over poles." Marte walked the length of the south wall, 12 feet so far, only 3 courses high. She crouched at the end where the wall stopped and touched the corner. The logs were stacked straight up, one on top of the other, with nothing to lock the end from peeling outward under settling pressure. "Your corners will fail," Marte said. "I know," Ragna said. "I do not know how to fix them." Marte stood and brushed dirt from her knees. She looked at the north wall, 20 feet long, the section burnt had knocked apart, now restacked tighter, and then back at the south. She looked at the tin sheets leaning against the barn. She looked at the sorted wood piles, the chalk marks on the logs, the charcoal numbers still visible on the barn floor through the open door. "Do you have coffee?" Marte asked. "No." Cresswell would not extend credit. "I have coffee in the wagon." They drank it in the barn, sitting on hay bales, while the cows shifted in their stalls, and the wind worked at the north eave. Marte asked questions, practical, specific, without sympathy. How many cords total? How fast the green wood was drying? Whether the cottonwood rounds were splitting or just checking? How Ragna planned to consume the inner faces without hollowing the load-bearing courses? Ragna answered what she could and admitted what she could not. She had no plan for consumption order. She had no method for the corners. She had no experience stacking anything higher than 5 courses, and the walls needed 20. Marte finished her coffee, set the cup on the hay bale, and said, "I will show you 3 things. Then I'm buying milk and leaving." She showed Ragna 3 things, and none of them were small. The first was cribbed corners. Marte pulled 4 logs from the sorted pile, 2 long, 2 short, and built a corner lock on the ground. She laid the long pieces parallel, then crossed the short pieces over the ends at right angles, alternating direction with each course. The result was a self-bracing lattice that pinned the wall ends together the way a cabin notch holds without nails. No joints to cut, no hardware to buy, just alternating courses locked at 90 degrees. "The railroad men built crib walls for bridge abutments," Marte said. "Same principle. The weight locks the crossing. The more you stack, the tighter it holds." She had Ragna build one. Ragna's first attempt was crooked. The second was better. The third held when Marte pushed it with her boot. The second lesson was drainage tilt. Marte made Ragna pull the bottom course of the south wall and start over. She gathered flat stones from the creek bank, 6 of them, each the size of a dinner plate, and laid them as a foundation. Then she set the first log so the outer face tilted slightly outward, no more than the width of a thumb across 4 feet. "Water runs down," Marte said. "If the bottom course sits flat on dirt, the melt wicks up through the bark and freezes. By January, your lowest courses are locked in ice and you cannot pull them for fuel. Tilt the face. Let the water run away from the passage." The third lesson was consumption order. Marte took a piece of chalk and walked the length of the north wall. She drew marks on the inside face, the face that would become the passage wall at regular intervals. Lower courses first. Inner face only. She chalked an X on every third log. "Burn the marked ones first," she said. "They are the ones you can pull without dropping the course above. Before you pull anything above the 4th course, brace the gap with a pole. Never hollow the middle, It carries the weight of everything above it. Never take 2 armloads from the same vertical seam, or you will open a channel the wind will find before you do. Ragna listened the way she had listened to her father, not just the words but the hands. Marte's hands were thick-knuckled, scarred across the left palm, and they moved over wood the way a farrier's hands moved over a hoof, reading by touch what the eye might miss. "One more thing," Marte said. She tapped her ear. "A good stack clicks at night when the cold settles. The wood contracts and the courses tighten. A bad stack pops and shifts. The logs are fighting each other instead of locking. If you hear popping, find the loose course before morning, or the wind will find it for you." Marte bought 4 gallons of milk, loaded the pails into her wagon, and drove out of the yard. She did not say she would return. She did not offer encouragement. She left the way she had arrived, with her list completed and nothing wasted. Ragna stood at the south wall and looked at the cribbed corner, the tilted foundation stones, and the chalk marks on the north face. 3 lessons, 3 problems solved. The wall was still only 12 feet long on the south side and 20 on the north. The tin cap was still 4 dented sheets. Her wrist still ached, but the corners would hold now, the drainage would work, and she knew how to burn without collapsing what she had built. She picked up the froe and went back to splitting. The construction became a clock. Every day was measured in courses laid, feet gained, and temperature lost. Ragna sorted wood by species and size. Heavy cottonwood and ash rounds went into the bottom 4 courses where weight meant stability. Straighter split pine went higher, where lighter pieces could be laid flat and tight without gaps. Round logs, the unsplit ones that breathed wind through their curved surfaces. She attacked with the froe and wedge until they were flat enough to stack. Her hands blistered, broke, healed rough, and blistered again. The left wrist swelled until she could not close her hand around the froe handle, and she learned to drive it with her right and brace with her forearm instead. Progress came in numbers she tracked on the pantry wall with pencil. November 9th. North wall at 25 feet, 6 courses. November 12th. North wall at 30 feet, 8 courses. November 15th. South wall at 18 feet, 4 courses. The north wall led because it faced the worst wind and needed to be finished first. The south wall could tolerate gaps longer because the barn blocked the southeast gusts. Marte came back on November 11th. She did not announce the visit as a return. She came to buy milk again, and when the milk was loaded, she walked to the north wall and inspected the cribbed corners. She pushed one with her boot. It held. She pushed harder. It held. She nodded, and then she picked up a crooked ash round that Ragna had rejected and showed her how to split it into 2 wedge-shaped pieces that would fill a gap between courses tighter than any flat piece could. "Waste nothing," Marte said. "Every piece has a place. The ones that do not fit straight fit crooked, and crooked fills gaps the wind would love." She stayed for 2 hours. They worked side by side on the south wall, lifting the heavy cottonwood rounds onto the lower courses in a rhythm that required no conversation, 1 woman on each end, a count of 3. The log settled into place, hands checked for fit, the next piece selected. By the time Marte left, the south wall had gained 4 feet in 2 courses. Ragna ate cold flour paste that night and listened to the north wall. It clicked, small, sharp sounds in the dark, like knuckles cracking. The wood was contracting in the cold, the courses tightening against each other. No pops, no shifting. Marte's lesson was holding. November brought 3 more setbacks before it ended. The first was the mule team, a neighbor's hired man driving a 4-mule hitch too fast along the coolie road, cut the corner near Ragna's south wall. The lead mule shied at the stacked wood, and the wagon brushed the end of the wall hard enough to knock out 6 feet of courses. 3 days of work scattered across frozen mud. Ragna rebuilt it in 2 days, using the cribbed corner method, and it came back tighter than before. But those were 2 days she did not have. The second was the tin. She had 4 sheets, each roughly 3 feet by 6, dented and bent from rejection at Cresswell's store. She needed them to span the 4-foot gap between walls and overlap enough to shed snow. On the first windy night after she laid them across the pole rafters, 3 sheets tore loose and sailed into the dark. She found 2 in the morning, bent worse than before. The third had landed in the creek and was too damaged to use. Ragna spent a full day flattening the recovered sheets with a mallet and punching new nail holes. She weighted the edges with stones until she could secure them with rawhide loops through the nail holes. Marte's suggestion, delivered on the next milk visit, offhand, as if the solution were obvious. Rawhide shrank in cold. The colder it got, the tighter the loops pulled. By January, the tin would be locked down by the weather itself. The third setback was Cresswell's boy. A freckled kid of 12, name of Dewey, rode into the yard one afternoon and counted Ragna's cattle from the saddle. He did not dismount. He did not speak to her. He counted the cows in the barn, counted the calves, looked at the heifer, wrote a number in a pocket notebook, and rode back toward Utica. Ragna watched him go and felt the debt tighten around her chest like a strap. $68.90. Payment before Christmas. She had $19 left after the nails and tin. The milk brought in small amounts. Marte paid fair, and 2 other buyers came irregularly. But $19 against 68 was not arithmetic that rewarded optimism. Cresswell was not waiting for winter to kill her. He was waiting for the ledger to do it. Marte's visits became a rhythm. Every 4 or 5 days she came for milk, and every visit she stayed longer. She taught by doing, not by talking. She showed Ragna how to brace the higher courses with leaning poles wedged against the ground, temporary supports that held the wall plumb while the upper courses were laid. She showed her how to read the grain of a split piece and place it bark side out so the smoother face took the weather. She showed her how to test a course by standing on it. If it shifted underfoot, it would shift under snow. They argued once. Ragna wanted to leave a gap at the bottom of the south wall for air circulation. Marte told her any gap below knee height was a gift to the wind. "You are thinking like a house builder," Marte said. "A house needs air because people breathe inside it. This passage needs to stop wind because people die inside wind. Seal the bottom, seal the ends. The only air that enters should come through the doors at each end, and those should have blankets hung across them in a blow." Ragna sealed the bottom. She did not like being wrong, and she liked less that Mart was right. But the next time the wind blew hard, the sealed passage was measurably calmer than the open end she had not yet finished. She could feel the difference in her face. Wind on one side, stillness on the other. Arne Solheim appeared in late November, unannounced and practical. He was 36, a blacksmith from the settlement near Utica, widowed 2 years earlier, with forearms thick as fence posts and a habit of fixing things he had not been asked to fix. He came to shoe one of Marte's mules and found himself in Ragna's yard because Marte had brought the mule there instead of to his shop. He looked at the passage, north wall nearly complete at 38 feet, south wall at 28, and said nothing for a long time. Then he walked to the barn end opening and examined the hinge where Ragna had hung a canvas flap to block wind entry. "This hinge is cracked," he said. "It will break before January." "I know," Ragna said. "I cannot afford a new one." He took the hinge off, carried it to a flat stone, and repaired it with a hammer and a short piece of strap iron he pulled from his saddlebag. The repair took 20 minutes. He did not ask for payment. Then he looked at the tin roof and frowned. "Your pitch is too flat," he said. "Snow will sit on it instead of sliding. 3 inches of wet snow on those sheets will bow the poles and collapse the cap." "The poles are strong enough," Ragna said. "The poles are strong enough for dry snow. The first warm spell after a storm puts wet weight on flat tin. You need a steeper pitch, at least 4 inches of drop per foot of span." Ragna resented the correction. She had spent 3 days setting those poles and nailing those sheets, and her wrist still ached from the mallet work. She looked at the roof and looked at Arnie and felt the irritation of someone who has been working alone too long to welcome advice easily. Then she looked again. The tin was nearly flat. She could see it now, the slight sag in the middle where the poles bowed under their own weight. Add snow, and the sag would deepen. Add wet snow, and the poles might crack. "How do I fix it without pulling the whole roof?" she asked. Arne showed her. He shimmed the south wall pole seats with flat stones, raising the south edge 4 inches above the north. The tin now sloped toward the north wall, the windward side, which meant snow would slide off into the drift that was already building against the outer face instead of sitting on the roof and adding weight. It was a 15-minute fix. It changed the roof from a liability to a functioning shed. Ragna said thank you, and the word came out stiff, like something she had not used recently. Arne shod the mule, nodded to Marte, and rode back toward Utica. He did not ask when he could return. He did not offer further help, but Ragna noticed that he had left the strap iron on the flat stone beside the repaired hinge, and strap iron was not cheap. By December 1st, the passage stood, 40 feet long, 8 feet high on both sides, 4 feet wide inside. The north wall faced the prevailing wind, dense, tight, bark side out, cribbed at both corners, tilted slightly for drainage, with Marte's chalk marks on every inside course. The south wall was slightly rougher. The last 8 feet had been finished in near dark on the final day of November, and Ragna could feel the imperfections with her hand even if she could not see them. The tin roof sloped north, secured with rawhide loops through punched holes, weighted at the edges with flat stones wired to the poles. The passage smelled of sap and iron. The tin ticked in the wind. The floor was packed earth, swept clean with a broom made from bundled sage. At the cabin end, a canvas flap hung from the repaired hinge. At the barn end, a second flap, this one cut from a grain sack and doubled for thickness, covered the opening. Rana stood inside the passage on the morning of December 1st and listened. The wind outside was moderate, 15 miles an hour, gusting higher. She could hear it against the outer face of the north wall, a steady low pressure, like a hand pressing flat against a door. Inside the passage, the air moved, but gently. She could feel it on her face. Cool, not cutting. The candle she held in her right hand flickered but did not blow out. She walked the full 40 feet. Cabin to barn. The milk pail hung from her left hand. Her boots sounded on packed earth. The walls rose above her on both sides, dark and dense, smelling of pine and cottonwood, and the faint iron tang of the tin overhead. She could see daylight at the barn end, a rectangle of gray sky framed by stacked wood. She reached the barn, milked the cows, carried the pail back through the passage, and set it on the kitchen table without spilling a drop. It was the first time since Peter's death that she had crossed the distance between buildings without bracing against the wind. But December was not January. The passage had not been tested. Not truly. 15-mile winds and moderate cold were not what killed people in the Judith Basin. What killed people was the wind that came without warning, the temperature that dropped 30 degrees in 3 hours, the snow that turned the world into a white room with no walls, no ceiling, and no floor. Bernd Ossen came back in the second week of December. He did not knock out any courses this time. He walked the passage from end to end, tapping his stick against the walls, pausing at each cribbed corner, looking up at the tin roof. He came out the barn end, stood in the wind, and turned to face Ragna. "Calmer in there than I expected," he said. "But," Ragna said, "but January is different from December." He tapped the stick against the frozen ground. A 30-mile blow is not a 60-mile blow. A 7 below night is not a 35 below night. You have built something. I will not say you have not, but I have seen men with better shelters die because they thought December proved January. "I am not proving anything," Ragna said. "I am keeping the cattle alive." "The cattle are not why you built this." He was wrong, and he was right. The cattle were the reason. The cattle were also not the only reason. Ragna said nothing, and Bernd rode home. Marit came the next day. She did not bring lard or warnings. She brought her 6-year-old son and walked him through the passage and back, holding his hand. The boy dragged his fingers along the stacked wood and asked why the walls were made of firewood. Marit looked at Ragna and said, "Because Mrs. Brecke builds things that do more than one job." It was the first time anyone had described the passage without mockery. Ragna felt something shift in her chest, not pride, not relief, but the particular ache of being understood by someone who had previously doubted. but Cresswell had not stopped. Hearing that neighbors were beginning to admire the passage instead of laugh at it, he spread a new story. The corridor would draw fire from the stovepipe and burn both buildings at once. A tunnel made of wood, he told anyone who would listen, was a fuse connecting two structures. One spark, one ember carried on a draft, and the whole thing would go up like a torch, taking the cabin, the barn, the cattle, and the widow with it. Ragnar heard the rumor from Marit and answered it by moving the ash barrels 3 feet from the cabin wall, clearing a gap around the stovepipe where it exited the roof, and refusing to store kindling anywhere inside the passage. The corridor was not a chimney. The wood was green, damp, and stacked too tight to catch from a stray ember, but the rumor had teeth because it was plausible, and plausible rumors did not need to be true to do damage. Marte heard the fire rumor and came to inspect. She walked the passage, checked the stovepipe clearance, looked at the gap between the cabin wall and the nearest wood course, and nodded. "He is not stupid," Marte said, meaning Cresswell. "He knows the passage works. That is why he is trying to make people afraid of it. A man does not attack something he believes will fail on its own." A telegraph notice reached Utica in the 3rd week of December. A severe cold wave was forming in the northern territories and moving south. The operator at Fort Benton relayed it to the stage office, and the stage driver told everyone between there and the Judith Basin. Cold coming. Hard cold. The kind that froze cattle standing and killed men between the house and the privy. The sky changed before the storm arrived. Too warm at noon, a false warmth that felt wrong, like a room heated by a fire that has already gone out. The eaves dripped, snow softened. Then the barometric pressure dropped and the warmth vanished as if someone had opened a door that should have stayed shut. By evening, the temperature had fallen 20 degrees and was still falling. Ragnar found the coughing calf in the east stall that night. A raspy, wet sound, the kind that meant fluid in the lungs. The calf was 4 months old, still nursing, too young to fight a respiratory infection without warmth and attention. She moved it to the stall nearest the wall, packed straw around it, and hung a blanket over the stall, opening to trap its own body heat. The calf coughed through the night. Ragnar did not sleep. She listened to the calf, and she listened to the passage. It clicked in the cold. Marte's sound, the good sound, the courses tightening. But under the clicking, she heard something else. A low, sustained note, almost below hearing, like a bow drawn across the lowest string of an instrument too large to see. It was the wind, finding the outer face of the north wall and pressing against it with the patient, constant weight of something that intended to stay. She lay in the dark and counted what she had. 14 cows, 2 calves, 1 sick, a passage that had not been tested in true cold, a stove with enough wood inside to last the night, a debt that would come due in 4 days, and a sky that was falling. The storm arrived on December 23rd as if it had been waiting for an audience. By morning, the temperature had dropped to 11 below zero, and the wind had shifted from southwest to straight north. The shift mattered more than the cold. Southwest wind hit the barn broadside and curled around both buildings in predictable patterns. North wind came straight down the coolie like a freight train on rails, hitting the passage wall flush and square, and every crack, every gap, every imperfection in the stacking became a whistle or a moan. Ragnar was in the barn at first light, checking the coughing calf, when the first true blast hit. The barn door slammed inward so hard it cracked the iron latch Arnie had repaired 3 weeks earlier. The sound was enormous. Not a bang, but a detonation, as if someone had fired a rifle inside the stall. The cows lunged against their stanchions. The coughing calf went flat on its side and did not get up. Ragnar caught the door with both hands and threw her weight against it, but the wind held it open and the snow came in horizontal, filling the air with a white that was not color but erasure. She got the door closed by bracing a hay fork against it. The latch was broken. She needed a new brace, or the wind would take the door again, and if the door opened, the cows would see daylight and push toward it, and a cow that pushes into a blizzard does not come back. Then she heard the tin roof. The sound was wrong, not the steady tick of contraction. A hammering, metallic, irregular, violent. One of the sheets was lifting. She could hear it catch the wind, slam back down, catch again, each cycle louder than the last. If the sheet tore free, it would leave a gap in the roof. Snow would pour into the passage and pack against the inside faces. By morning, the burn face wood, the fuel she needed, would be locked under ice. She had to fix the roof. She had to fix the barn door. The calf could not stand. The wind was at 40 miles an hour and climbing. Ragna left the barn through the passage. This was the moment, not a metaphor, not a principle. A woman walking into a corridor of stacked firewood during a blizzard to see if the thing she had built with bleeding hands and a swollen wrist and 20 cords of wood hauled by a dead man would hold. The barn end canvas flap snapped against her face as she pushed through it. Inside the passage, the air changed. The wind was there. She could feel it, but it was not the same wind. At the barn entrance, it was a fist. 10 feet in, it was a shove. 20 feet in, it was a pressure. 30 feet in, it was a draft. Snow sifted through cracks between courses. Fine, dry, crystalline. It fell in thin lines like sand through fingers. But it did not blind her. It did not fill the air. She could see the cabin end flap ahead of her, gray against dark, 40 feet away. She could walk. She reached the hammering tin at the midpoint. One sheet had worked loose where a rawhide loop had stretched in the warm spell before the storm. The sheet was lifting 6 inches with each gust, slamming back, lifting again. She could not reach it from the ground. The ceiling was 8 feet up, so she climbed the south wall. She braced her boots on the 4th course, gripped the 7th, and pulled herself up until she could touch the tin with her right hand. The metal was so cold it burned through her glove. She pulled the loose edge down, held it with her knee, and retied the rawhide with fingers that felt thick and distant, as if they belonged to someone else. The loop tightened. She tied a second loop through the same hole, pulling it so hard the rawhide creaked. The hammering stopped. The tin settled. She climbed down with arms shaking and stood in the passage, breathing. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next few minutes decide whether her work saves only a woman or an entire herd. She went back to the barn through the passage, 40 feet, walked steady, no rope, no crawling, no blindness. The barn door was still braced with the hay fork. The cows were pressed together in the east stalls, eyes wide, breath coming in clouds. The coughing calf lay on its side with its legs tucked and its ribs moving fast. Ragna braced the door properly. She pulled 3 sticks from the marked inside course of the north wall, the first fuel she had ever taken from the passage, Pursima, and carried them to the barn. She wedged 2 behind the hay fork as additional bracing and split the 3rd into the stove at the cabin end of the passage, moving through the corridor with the ease of a woman walking a hallway in her own house. The stove took the wood. The cabin warmed. The passage was earning its keep 3 ways at once: barrier against wind, walkway between buildings, and fuel source within arm's reach. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 22 below. The wind was steady at 50 miles an hour. Visibility outside the passage was measured in feet. 5, sometimes 3, sometimes nothing but white. Ragna hung a strip of flour sack at the barn end of the passage and another at the cabin end. The barn end strip whipped sideways. The cabin end strip trembled but hung mostly straight. The passage was killing the wind. She moved through it 6 times that day, milking, feeding, watering from the barrel she kept inside the barn, checking the calf, which was still breathing but refused to stand. Each crossing took 90 seconds. Each crossing happened in relative calm while the world outside screamed. At 3 in the afternoon, someone pounded on the barn door. Ragna pulled the hay fork brace and opened the door into a wall of white. A figure fell through the opening, literally fell, pitching forward onto the barn floor with arms outstretched and face covered in ice. She caught him by the coat before his head hit the frozen ground. It was Tolef Nesheim, 17 years old, a neighbor's hired boy, half frozen and making sounds that were not words. He had been riding from a hay meadow 5 miles east when the storm hit, and he had lost the road within minutes. His horse had turned broadside to the wind and refused to move. Tolef had dismounted and walked, and he had found the passage wall by accident stumbling into it face first in zero visibility, then following it by touch with both hands flat against the stacked wood until he reached the barn end opening. He could not have found the barn without the wall. The barn was invisible from 10 feet away. The wall was 40 feet long, and any point along it led to shelter. Ragna dragged him inside, closed the door, and took him through the passage to the cabin. She stripped his gloves. The fingers underneath were white and rigid. She set him beside the stove, wrapped him in every blanket she owned, and fed him warm water with a spoon because his jaw was locked and he could not drink from a cup. Tolliff shook for 3 hours. By evening, his fingers were red and swelling, which meant blood was returning, which meant he might keep them. He spoke his first coherent words near midnight. "I thought the wall was a building. I could not believe it was made of wood." Outside, the storm did not care what anyone believed. Through the night, Ragna moved between cabin and barn every 2 hours. The calf needed warmth. The cattle needed water. The barn door brace needed checking after every heavy gust. Each trip through the passage was the same. Push through the cabin flap, walk 40 feet in relative calm, push through the barn flap into noise and cold, and the smell of hay and manure and animal fear. The passage walls groaned under the wind. Snow packed against the outer face until the north wall looked like a snowdrift from outside. A long, straight drift that rose 8 feet and stretched 40. But inside, the wood held. The courses did not shift. The clicks came steady, not panicked. The tin stayed down. At 4 in the morning, she heard a different pounding. Not the wind, not the tin. A human fist on the north wall, somewhere near the middle. She took the lantern into the passage and shouted. The pounding moved toward the barn end. She followed it inside the passage, matching the sound through the wood. Burnt Asen came through the barn end opening covered in snow, ice in his beard, his walking stick gone, one hand bleeding from where he had been hitting the wall to find the end. He had been checking a culvert on the road above the coolie when the storm blinded him. He had walked downhill because downhill meant water, and water meant habitation, and he had found the passage the same way Tolliff had, by walking into it. He stood in the barn, breathing in gasps, and looked at Ragna with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not gratitude. It was recalibration. The man who had measured 40 feet with his stick and called it impossible was standing alive because 40 feet of stacked firewood had given him something to follow when the world disappeared. Ragna gave him a blanket and sent him through the passage to the cabin where Tolliff was sleeping by the stove. She did not say anything about his earlier verdict. There was nothing to say that the storm had not already said. The worst came between 4 and 7 in the morning. The wind hit 60 miles an hour. The temperature bottomed at 31 below. The combination created a wind chill that could freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. Ragna knew this not because she measured it, but because she left a wet rag on the barn end door frame at 4:15 and found it frozen stiff at 4:17. Contrast arrived with daylight and bad news. Marit's husband, Leif, had tried to cross from their shed to their house, 60 feet, with a rope, and came back with both ears frostbitten white. He would keep the ears, but the skin would blister and peel, and he would feel cold in them for the rest of his life. A steer at the Hackett outfit froze standing in an open shed after drifting snow blocked the feed trough. The hired men found it upright and dead, ice in its nostrils, eyes open, as if it had simply stopped being alive without the courtesy of falling down. And Davy Rusk, one of Cresswell's hired cowboys, 23, healthy, experienced on the plains, was found in a hay depression 90 yards from the bunkhouse. He had gone to check the stock corral at midnight and never come back. They found him at dawn, alive but unconscious, with his left boot missing and 3 toes on that foot already black. He had walked 90 yards in the wrong direction and could not find his way back. 90 yards, less than the length of Ragna's passage. Davy Rusk lost the toes. The doctor in Utica took them in January, and Davy walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He had been 90 yards from warmth and could not find it. Ragna had been 40 feet from warmth and had walked it 12 times in 24 hours without losing her way once. Inside the cabin, the stove used less wood than she expected. Marty had predicted this, though she had not explained it in those terms. With the passage wall shielding the cabin's north face, the wind no longer struck the kitchen wall directly. The drafts through the unchinked gaps slowed to a trickle. The stove did not have to fight the wind for control of the room's temperature. It just had to maintain warmth in a space that was no longer hemorrhaging heat. Ragna noticed the water pail near the door. It had not frozen solid. In every previous cold snap, the pail skinned over within an hour of the stove going low. Now, 12 hours into the worst storm she had experienced in Montana, the water was cold but liquid. She pressed her hand into it. Cold, not frozen. She did not celebrate. She walked through the passage to the barn, fed the cattle, broke ice in the water barrel, checked the calf, still breathing, still coughing, but standing now, swaying on legs that trembled but held, and walked back, 90 seconds each way. The storm broke at noon on December 24th. The wind dropped. The snow stopped. The sky opened to a blue so vivid it looked fake, as if someone had painted it there to apologize for the night before. Ragna opened the cabin door and looked at the passage. The windward side was buried. The north wall was invisible under a drift that sloped from ground level to the tin roof in a smooth, unbroken curve. From outside, the passage looked like a long, low hill of snow. From inside, she walked through it one more time to be certain the floor was clear. Snow had sifted through cracks and lay in thin lines along the base of both walls, but the passage was walkable, dry in the middle, smelling of pine and cold iron. She opened the barn and counted. 14 cows, 2 calves, 1 heifer, all standing, all breathing. The coughing calf stood in the corner of the east stall with mucus on its nose and its eyes clear. It would need watching, but it was alive. Everything was alive. Ragna leaned against the barn door frame and looked at the buried passage and the clean blue sky and the coolie white and silent under new snow. Her hands were raw. Her wrist throbbed. She had not slept in 36 hours. Bernd Assen and Tolef Neschheim were in her cabin drinking her last coffee. Everything was alive, and the wood was still standing. Bernd Assen left on Christmas morning. The sky was still, and the road was passable if a man rode slow and kept to the wind-blown ridges where the snow had been scoured to a crust. He stood in Ragna's yard with a borrowed scarf around his neck. His own had been lost in the storm, and looked at the passage the way a man looks at a bridge he did not believe could hold weight. The drift on the windward side was already settling. Meltwater from the tin roof had frozen into a glaze along the north face, sealing the bark and outer courses under a shell of ice. The south face was dry, the cribbed corners still sharp and locked, the chalk marks on the inside courses untouched except where Ragna had pulled the 3 sticks for the barn door brace. Bernd did not apologize. Apology was not a currency he traded in. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and his replacement walking stick, a broom handle Ragna had given him, tucked under his arm. "I measured the distance wrong," he said. "It was not 40 feet. It was the wind I failed to measure." Ragna said nothing. She did not need his contrition. She needed him to see what had worked and carry that scene back to the people who listened to him. "What would you have done differently?" Bernd asked. "I would have started in September," Ragna said, "and I would have asked you to help instead of waiting for you to tell me I could not." Bernd almost smiled again. This time it lasted longer, a full second, maybe 2, before the habitual severity of his face reassembled itself. He touched the brim of his hat, mounted his horse, and rode out of the coulee with the broom handle across his saddle where the walking stick used to be. He would not return for 3 weeks. But what he said in those 3 weeks mattered more than any visit. Bernd Assen was the road commissioner, the former trail boss, the man whose judgment on winter matters had the weight of decades behind it. When he told people at the Utica post office that the Brecke woman's wood passage had saved his life in the December blow, the laughter stopped. Not all of it. Not everywhere. But enough to change the sound of Ragna's name when it was spoken in the stores and at the crossroads. Marit Haugland came on the 27th carrying a coffee sack filled with mending wool. The wool was an excuse. Marit could mend at home. She came because she needed to see the passage with her own eyes, in daylight, with the storm behind her and the evidence in front of her. Ragna walked her through it. 40 feet. Marit ran her hand along the inside wall, feeling the courses, the gap sealed with wedge-split scraps, the chalk marks that told Ragna where to burn and where to leave the wood standing. At the midpoint, Marit stopped and looked up at the tin roof. "How wide does it have to be?" she asked. 4 feet is enough to walk with a pail. If you want to carry hay flakes, you need 4.5. How do you cap the walls? Poles across, tin over the poles, rawhide loops through the nail holes. The cold tightens the rawhide. Can hay do the same work? Ragna shook her head. Hay insulates, but it draws animals. Mice nest in it. Cattle will eat through it. And it rots from the bottom when meltwater reaches it. Cordwood stacks tighter, does not draw vermin the same way, and can be burned in sequence when you need fuel. Hay cannot be burned in sequence. It goes all at once or not at all. She pulled a stick from the inside face, one of the marked ones, a split pine piece near the bottom of the fourth course. Behind it, the next layer was dry, tight, and untouched. "See?" Ragna said. "You pull from the inside. The outside stays solid. The wind never knows you took anything." Marit touched the dry face behind the pulled stick. She pressed her palm flat against it the way Ragna had pressed her palm against her father's woodpile in Telemark. She felt what Ragna had felt. Stillness behind mass. The wind stopped at the surface and the air behind it was calm. "Leif's ears are still bandaged," Marit said. "He went 60 feet with a rope and nearly lost them. You went 40 feet 12 times and did not lose anything." "I lost 3 sticks," Ragna said. "I used them to brace the barn door." Marit laughed. It was the first time Ragna had heard her laugh since before Pater's funeral. Over the following week, 3 more people came, not to mock, not to stare, to ask. A widower named Sjur Tveit, who ran sheep on the bench above the coolie, came with a question about a shorter version, a 12-foot passage between his dugout and his lambing shed. Ragna told him 12 feet was too short to break serious wind. He needed at least 20, and the walls could be 3 feet thick instead of 4 if the shed blocked the approach from the southeast. He wrote the measurements on the back of a feed receipt and thanked her. A young couple named Espeland, new to the basin, came to look. The husband said nothing. The wife asked about cost. Ragna told her the cost was 20 cords of wood and 6 weeks of labor. The wife's face fell. Ragna added that a smaller version wanted 10 cords, 2 shorter walls, just enough to cover the house-to-barn distance, could be built in 2 weeks by 2 people working together. The wife looked at her husband. He looked at the walls. They left without speaking, but Ragna saw them measuring the distance between their own buildings the next day from the road. Marit came back again, this time with specific plans. She wanted a 6-cord passage between her house and the wash shed, where she heated water for laundry and bathed the children. It was a shorter distance, 20 feet now, but the crossing was exposed to northwest wind, and she had already lost a wash tub to a gust that November. "I do not have tin," Marit said. "Use split poles laid close, then pile brush on top. It will not shed snow as clean as tin, but it will keep the worst from packing in the corridor. Shovel after every storm." "How thick do the walls need to be?" 2 feet if the wash shed blocks wind from one side. 3 feet if you are exposed on both. Marit built it in January. Her first attempt failed because she left a gap at the bottom for the chickens to walk through. Wind knifed through the opening and filled the passage with spindrift within an hour. She came to Ragna furious with herself. Ragna did not scold. She walked to Marit's claim, crouched at the gap, and pressed Marit's hand against the draft the way Marte had pressed lessons into Ragna, through touch, through the body, through the knowledge that the wind teaches faster than any voice. "The wind reads mistakes," Ragna said. It was Marte's phrase, and she heard Marte's voice behind her own when she said it. Marit sealed the bottom course. The passage held through the next blow. Measurable results accumulated like evidence in a trial where the verdict was still contested. During the December storm, Ragna had burned 1¼ cords from the passage walls, measured by counting the sticks she pulled from the marked courses and stacking them in the cabin before feeding them to the stove. The conventional estimate for a drafty cabin in that wind was 2 cords or more. The passage had cut her fuel consumption by more than a third, not because the stove burned less, but because the stove had less work to do. The north wall of the cabin, shielded by the passage, was no longer losing heat to direct wind. The stove maintained temperature instead of fighting for it. The barn had stayed reachable through every hour of the storm. Milk production had dipped. The cows gave less when stressed by noise and cold. But it had not collapsed. No cow froze. No cow wandered into the storm. The sick calf lived, though it coughed through January and remained thin. These were not stories. These were numbers. And numbers traveled the Judith Basin the way Bernt's verdict had traveled. Slowly, on horseback, from mouth to mouth, gaining weight with each retelling because they could be checked. Cresswell's reaction was not conversion. It was adaptation. Seeing the community's attention shift from mockery to admiration, he did what storekeepers do when a new market appears. He tried to own it. Within 2 weeks of the storm, Cresswell began offering what he called Cresswell Storm Corridors, pre-cut green wood sold in 10-cord bundles with a printed sheet of instructions he had written himself. The instructions were wrong in 3 places. They recommended 2-foot-thick walls which were too thin for exposed positions. They said nothing about cribbed corners. They suggested stacking on bare ground without drainage stones. Ragna heard about the scheme from Marit and said nothing for 2 days. On the 3rd day, a Sunday, she stood outside the church in Utica after the service and spoke to anyone who would listen. She did not sell anything. She did not advertise. She taught. She gave the measurements aloud. 4 feet thick if fully exposed to prevailing wind. 2 feet only if backed by a bank or a larger building. Cap the top with poles and tin or split pole brush. Drain the bottom with flat stones. Tilt the outer face. Never leave gaps in the windward face. Burn from the inside. Marked courses only. Brace before pulling anything above the 4th course. She drew the cribbed corner on the back of a hymn sheet, passed it around, and answered questions for an hour. Cresswell stood in the doorway of his store across the road and watched. He did not come outside. Marte Lund came for the last time in late January. The winter had settled into its deepest rhythm, short days, long cold, the sky a permanent iron ceiling that gave nothing and took everything. The passage had been standing for 2 months. The inner faces showed the marks of use, gaps where sticks had been pulled, pole braces where Ragna had reinforced the load-bearing courses, scorch marks near the cabin end, where a carried ember had fallen from the stove loading and burned a circle into the packed earth floor before she stamped it out. Marte's cough had been getting worse since December. She had dismissed it the way she dismissed everything that interfered with work, by ignoring it until ignoring became impossible. But by January, the cough had a sound that Ragna recognized from the calf. Wet. Deep. The sound of fluid in a place where air should be. Marte came for milk. She stayed because the cough bent her double in the yard, and she could not climb back into the wagon for 10 minutes. Ragna brought her inside through the passage. The older woman walked the 40 feet slowly, one hand on the south wall, her breathing audible over the wind. At the cabin end, she sat by the stove and drank warm water and did not speak for a long time. "You need a doctor," Ragna said. "I need a doctor to tell me what I already know," Marte said. "I need warm air and less work, and a place that does not require me to hitch mules in the dark." They sat in silence. The stove ticked. The passage walls clicked outside, contracting in the cold, doing their work without being asked. "I have a niece near Helena," Marte said. "She has written twice. I have not answered." "Answer her." "If I leave, I will not come back." Ragna knew this was true. Helena was lower, warmer, and closer to a railroad doctor. The Judith Basin was high, cold, and hard on lungs that had spent 6 years breathing coal dust in a railroad cookhouse. If Marte went to Helena, she was going to die there. Not immediately. But eventually, and sooner than either of them wanted to count. They did not discuss this directly. They discussed the passage. Marte walked Ragna through a final inspection. She checked every cribbed corner, tested every brace pole, counted the sticks pulled from the burn face, and calculated the remaining fuel. She revised 2 of the chalk marks, moving them to courses that were better supported and could be pulled without weakening the wall above. She showed Ragna a crack in the south wall where frost heave had shifted a foundation stone, and they fixed it together, levering the stone back into position with the broom handle Burnt had left behind. On the last day, Marte gave Ragna her cordwood tally stick. It was 3 feet long, notched with decades of measurements. Each notch a cord, each group of notches a winter, each winter a life kept warm by wood that had been counted and stacked and burned in the right order. "Do not teach them the trick," Marte said. "Teach them the reason. The trick is wood against wind. The reason is that heat lost is harder to replace than heat kept. If they understand the reason, they will figure out the trick themselves. If they only learn the trick, they will build it wrong and blame you when it fails." Marty climbed into her wagon with effort she tried to hide. She drove the mules out of the yard and down the coolie road without looking back. Her cough was audible until the wagon was out of sight. Ragna stood at the passage entrance with the tally stick in her hand and listened to the coughing fade into the distance and then into the wind and then into nothing. She went back inside. The passage smelled of sap and cold iron. The chalk marks were fresh where Marty had revised them. The walls clicked, settling in the cold, doing what they had been built to do. The tally stick was warm from Marte's hand. Ragna set it on the shelf beside the stove, next to the pencil marks tracking the wood she had burned and the storms she had survived. It was not an heirloom. It was a tool. But tools carry the hands that use them, and Marte's hands had measured more wood than Ragna would measure in a lifetime. A letter arrived 6 weeks later, written in a niece's handwriting. Marte Lund had died in Helena on a Tuesday in late February, in a warm room with glass windows and a coal stove that did not need feeding through the night. The letter said she had been comfortable. Ragna doubted this, but she kept the letter in the coffee tin where the money used to be because the tin was empty now and needed something in it that was worth keeping. The second winter came fast. By autumn of 1888, Ragna had rebuilt the passage walls with lessons that the first year had taught her body. She replaced the cottonwood rounds in the lower courses with heavier ash. Ash held shape better through freeze-thaw cycles and did not check as badly. She added removable pole ribs inside the corridor, spaced every 6 feet, so the passage could narrow as wood was consumed without losing structural support. She built a shorter calf run inside the barn from stacked slabs, 3 feet high, 8 feet long, to protect newborns from the door drafts that came even through the canvas flap. The improvements were small. Together, they changed the passage from a desperate gamble into a system, but the passage could not protect anyone beyond its 40 feet. And the second winter tested Ragna in a way the first had not, by demanding that she trust someone else to build what she had taught. It happened in late November, during one of the sudden ground blizzards that came after a thaw. Warm air moved in from the south, softened the snow, turned the roads to mud, and fooled everyone into thinking winter had relaxed its grip. Then the wind shifted. The temperature dropped 25 degrees in 2 hours. The wet snow on the ground froze into a crust, and new snow came hard and low, racing across the surface like smoke. A schoolteacher named Clara Flatten had 4 children in her care. 3 students she was returning to homesteads along the Basin Road, and her own daughter, 8 years old, riding beside her on the wagon seat. The warm morning had made the trip seem safe. The ground blizzard made it lethal. Clara lost the road within minutes of the shift. The horse stopped. The children could not see the ground. Clara could not see the horse's ears from the seat. She knew 3 things. They were somewhere east of Marit Hogland's claim. They were less than a mile from a building, and a mile might as well be 100 in zero visibility at ground level. She also knew, because she had heard Ragna's measurements at the church, and because she had listened when Ragna explained why the passage worked, that Marit had built a 20-foot wood corridor between her house and the wash shed. Clara pointed the horse downhill because downhill meant the coolie bottom, and the coolie bottom meant claims, and claims meant buildings. The horse walked. The children held each other in the wagon bed. Clara's daughter pressed against her mother's side and said nothing. The horse found Marit's fence by walking into it. Clara heard the wire sing and stopped. She climbed down, followed the fence by hand to the gate, followed the gate to the yard, and found the end of Marit's wood passage by stumbling against it the way Tolef and Bernd had stumbled against Ragna's wall the year before, blind, freezing, and guided by nothing but mass. She followed the wall by touch, 20 feet. Her hand moved over stacked cordwood, 3 feet thick, bark side out, the courses tight, the bottom sealed. She reached the house end. Marit had the door open before Clara knocked, because Marit had been watching the passage entrance the way Ragna had taught her to watch it, not for weather, but for hands. The 4 children came through the passage one at a time, Clara pulling each by the wrist. The youngest was crying. The oldest was silent in a way that frightened Marit more than the crying. They were cold but not frostbitten. They were alive because a 20-foot wall of stacked cordwood had given a blinded schoolteacher something to follow when the road disappeared. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the storm arrives. The news traveled faster than any previous story about the passage. Children were involved, parents were terrified, and the detail that mattered, that the schoolteacher had found the wall by touch in zero visibility, was the same detail that had saved Bernd and Tolef, repeated in a different storm on a different claim, proving that the principle was not luck. It was design. Ragna heard the news from Marit, who told it plainly and without pride. She said the passage had worked. She said the bottom course had held. She said the children were fine. Then Marit said something else. The gap I left for the chickens, the one you made me fix, that was the first thing I thought about when the wind hit. I thought, if that gap were still there, the snow would have filled the passage before Clara reached the door. Ragna remembered crouching at the gap, pressing Marit's hand against the draft. She remembered Marte's voice. The wind reads mistakes. 1 gap, 1 correction. 4 children alive. This was what Marte had meant, not the trick, the reason. If Marit had copied the passage without understanding why the bottom course mattered, she would have left the gap because it was convenient. The convenience would have killed a schoolteacher and 4 children in a ground blizzard on a warm day that turned deadly. Cresswell heard the story and responded the way a man responds when the ground beneath his authority shifts. He did not attack the passage. He attacked Ragna. He told anyone who would listen that the wood corridors were a hazard, that untrained people building them would create fire traps, structural collapses, and false confidence that would lead to more deaths than they prevented. He said Ragna was causing panic and wasting fuel across the valley, but the parents of the 4 children had names, faces, and voices, and they used them. They stood in Cresswell's store and told him their children were alive because of a wall of stacked firewood that his own greenwood scheme could not have built. They told him his 2-foot-thick instruction sheet was a death sentence in a real wind. They told him the woman he had tried to take cattle from had taught their neighbor to stack a wall that saved their children. Cresswell retreated behind his counter. He did not apologize. He stopped selling the corridor kits. The printed instruction sheets disappeared from the counter, though Ragna heard he kept a stack of them in the back room for months, unable to throw them away because throwing them away meant admitting they had been wrong. The community was shifting, not all at once, not with ceremony. Shifts like this never announced themselves. But Ragna noticed that people began arriving at her claim not to buy milk, but to ask questions. How thick? How high? How far apart? Which species holds best? How to read a settling wall by sound, whether pine burned cleaner than cottonwood from the inside face. She answered every question. She drew corners on the backs of receipts. She loaned the tally stick to a man building his first wall so he could measure courses against Marte's notches. She taught them the reason first. Heat lost is harder to replace than heat kept. And the trick second. Marte would have approved. Ragna could hear the approval in the silence where the old woman's cough used to be. But approval from the dead is not the same as partnership with the living, and the winter was not finished asking Ragna to carry its weight alone. Arne Solheim had been coming more often since the December storm, not to fix hinges, not to argue about tin pitch. He came with strap iron and left without it. He came with a repaired mule shoe and refused payment. He came once with a sack of coffee, real coffee, not chicory, and set it on the table without explanation. Ragna watched him the way she watched a wall under construction, with attention, with patience, and with the knowledge that what a thing looked like during assembly was not always what it would look like when finished. They argued. This was how it began, and how it would continue. He wanted iron straps across the tin seams to prevent the lifting that had nearly cost Ragna the roof during the December storm. She countered that iron straps were expensive, heavy, and would transfer cold through the roof into the passage. Rawhide loops, she said, shrank tight in cold and released in spring for adjustment. They were free, flexible, and replaced the physics of the problem instead of fighting it. Arnie considered this. He picked up a rawhide loop, stretched it, felt the give, and looked at the tin seam where Ragna had retied it during the storm. It held, he said. It held because cold makes it tighter. Your iron straps would be the same tightness all winter. Rawhide adjusts with the temperature. The colder it gets, the harder it grips. He nodded. He did not say she was right. He put the iron straps back in his saddlebag and stayed for dinner. The courtship, if it could be called that, unfolded through shared work and quiet meals, and the particular intimacy of two people who had each buried a spouse and did not need to explain what that meant. He waited for her answers instead of assuming them. She noticed. It was the first thing about him that mattered to her beyond his skill with a forge, and she filed it away the same way she filed away the memory of her father's hand, carefully, without hurrying, knowing it would be needed later. Spring of 1889 came to Elk Coulee the way spring comes to high country, not as a season, but as a negotiation. Warm days followed by freezing nights, snowmelt running in the coulee bottom while drifts still clung to the north-facing slopes. The passage walls stood through March, their outer faces weathered gray-white, bark peeling in strips, the ice glaze from the December storm long melted. The inner faces showed the winter's accounting, gaps where Ragna had pulled marked courses, pole braces wedged into the spaces. The chalk lines faded, but still readable. She did not dismantle the passage when the snow melted. This was the decision that separated the first winter's desperation from the second winter's design. Other people would have pulled the remaining wood, stacked it near the house, and called the experiment finished. Ragna left the walls standing and spent April studying what the winter had taught the wood. Cottonwood in the lower courses had checked badly, long cracks running with the grain where freeze-thaw cycles had split the fibers. The rounds were still solid, still heavy, but the checking meant moisture had penetrated deeper than bark alone could stop. Ash had held better. The ash rounds in the lowest courses were tight, smooth-faced, with only surface weathering. They could go another winter without replacement. Pine in the upper courses had dried over the season and was lighter than it had been in October. This was an advantage for fuel. Drier wood burned hotter and cleaner, but a disadvantage for wind resistance, because lighter courses shifted more easily under sustained pressure. Ragna made a note on the pantry wall. Replace upper pine with fresh-cut rounds each autumn, and move the dried pine to the inside face where it would be burned first. She added removable pole ribs, 6 of them, spaced every 7 feet along the passage, braced against the floor, and wedged against the underside of the tin roof. As the inner walls thinned from fuel consumption, the ribs kept the corridor from widening beyond what the tin could span. If one section was burned faster than the others, the rib at that point could be moved inward to close the gap. The passage was no longer a fixed structure. It was adjustable, a machine made of wood and habit, tuned by the woman who lived inside it. The calf run in the barn proved its worth in March, when the heifer finally dropped. The calf came at 2 a.m. during a late-season squall, not a blizzard, but enough wind to drive snow through the barn door and coat the east stalls in a layer of white. The newborn calf lay in the slab-walled run, protected from the draft, warm enough to dry before the cold could take it. Ragna found it standing at dawn, wet-nosed and wobbly, pressing against its mother's flank. 15 head now. The herd was growing. Teaching became a second labor, parallel to the ranch work, and it carried its own tensions. Through the summer and into the autumn of 1889, people came to learn. Some came ready, some came resistant. The difference was not in their willingness, but in their listening, and Ragna learned quickly that the hardest part of teaching was not showing the method, but making people understand why the method worked before they tried to copy it. A rancher from the bench above the Judith Basin, a man named Herbrand Grindheim, 40, with a face like chapped leather and a habit of finishing other people's sentences, came in August to see the passage. He walked through it twice, measured the walls with a knotted rope, and announced that he could build the same thing in a week using green logs straight from the timber. Green logs will shrink, Ragna said. By January, you will have gaps in every course wide enough to pass your hand through. I will chink them. Chinking holds in a cabin wall because the wall does not move. A freestanding cordwood wall moves. It settles, contracts, shifts with temperature. Chinking cracks and falls out. The gaps open. The wind comes through. My father chinked every building he ever built. Your father built buildings with roofs, foundations, and 4 walls bracing each other. You're building a freestanding corridor with 2 walls and a tin cap. The physics are different. Herbrand did not like being told the physics were different by a woman who weighed less than his saddle. He built his corridor with green logs and chinked the gaps with mud and moss. By December, the chinking had cracked and fallen in strips. The wind whistled through the walls so badly that his wife refused to use the passage and went back to the rope method. Herbrand came to Ragna in January, angry at the green logs as if they had betrayed him, and asked what he had done wrong. Ragna did not say she had told him. She walked to his claim, inspected the walls, and showed him how to split the worst green rounds with a froe and wedge them back into the gaps as shims. It was not a permanent fix. It was a patch that would hold until spring, when he could replace the green courses with seasoned wood. Next time, Ragna said, split before you stack, and stack before you chink. The wood is the chinking. If the wood is tight, you do not need anything else. Herbrand listened this time. His second version, built the following autumn with seasoned split pine, held through a January blow without losing a single course. He never thanked Ragna directly, but he sent his wife with 2 pounds of butter and a note that said, "The passage works," in handwriting so cramped it looked like the letters were arguing with each other. Other lessons were harder. A family named Kavame, new to the basin, built a half-height passage, 4 feet tall, 2 feet thick, because they did not have enough wood for full walls. They intended to crawl through it during storms. Ragna heard about the design from Marit and rode to the Kavame claim the same day. A 4-foot wall does not break 8-foot wind, she said. It deflects it. The wind hits the top of your wall and rolls over it and comes down inside the passage harder than if the wall were not there. You have built a funnel, not a shelter. The Kavamas did not have more wood. They could not afford to buy it. Ragna spent 2 days helping them redesign the passage, 6 feet tall instead of 4, using the existing wood for one wall and banking the other side against a rise in the ground that gave natural height. The earthen bank was not as clean as a wood wall, but it was tall enough to break the wind above the corridor. The revised passage held through the winter. The Kavame's children walked through it every morning to reach the stock shed. Teaching cost time. Every ride to a neighbor's claim was a day away from her own work. Every lesson was an hour not spent stacking, milking, or mending. Ragna began to feel the pull between what the ranch needed and what the community needed, and the pull did not resolve itself neatly. Some days she chose the ranch, some days she chose the teaching. On the days she chose the teaching, the milk went late and the cattle complained in their particular bovine way, and she came home in the dark to a stove that had gone cold. But the alternative, keeping the knowledge to herself, letting people build corridors wrong, letting children walk through 4-foot walls that funneled wind instead of stopping it, was not something she could carry. Marty's voice was in her ear, and the voice said the same thing every time. Teach them the reason. Harvey Cresswell's reckoning came in late March of 1890. and it came the way most reckonings come to men who wait for other people's failure. Not through confrontation, but through the ordinary cruelty of weather and bad timing. He left Utica on a Wednesday to collect on a small note before the spring roads turned to mud. The note was held by a family near the head of the coolie, $22 owed on seed grain, and Cresswell wanted it settled before the end of the month. He could have sent a letter. He could have waited. But Cresswell collected debts in person because the physical presence of the creditor reminded people that money was not abstract. It was a man standing in your doorway. He wrote alone. The morning was clear. By mid-afternoon, a late-season blow came down from the north. Not a blizzard, but a hard, cold wind with snow thick enough to cut visibility to a quarter mile. Cresswell was on the bench road above Elk Coulee when the wind hit, and his horse, a town animal not accustomed to open country and bad weather, turned its hindquarters to the wind and refused to face north. Cresswell dismounted and tried to lead the horse. The wind pushed him sideways. Snow packed in his collar and melted down his back. He was not dressed for exposure. A town coat, leather gloves, no scarf, no blanket roll. He had expected a 2-hour ride, not a survival exercise. The horse foundered in a drift on the downhill slope. Cresswell pulled the reins, and the horse pulled back, and the reins snapped, and the horse turned and walked the other direction and disappeared into the white. Cresswell was alone on foot, on a slope he could not see the bottom of, in wind that was getting worse. He did what any man in that position does. He walked downhill. Downhill meant the coulee bottom. The coulee bottom meant buildings. Buildings meant warmth. He walked for 20 minutes. The snow thickened. He could not see more than 30 feet in any direction. He was not panicked. Cresswell was not a man given to panic, but he was cold in a way that had stopped being uncomfortable and started being informative. His fingers were numb. His ears burned. He could feel the cold settling into his chest like a second set of lungs made of ice. He saw the dark line through the snow before he understood what it was. It rose from the ground like a wall, because it was a wall, a long, straight, dark line running perpendicular to the slope, 8 feet high, covered in snow on the windward face but visible on the leeward side where the bark showed through in patches. He reached it and put his hands on it and felt stacked wood under his palms. He followed the wall by touch. 40 feet. His hands moved over the courses the way Tollef's had, the way Bernt's had, the way Clara Flatten's had, blind, freezing, guided by nothing but mass. He reached the barn end opening and pushed through the canvas flap and stood inside the passage with his back against the south wall and his chest heaving. He could hear the stove through the cabin end flap. He could smell smoke and coffee and the particular warmth of a house where someone had been keeping the fire all day. Ragna found him there. She had heard no pounding, no shout. She had gone to the barn end to check the canvas flap, which had been snapping in the wind, and found Cresswell standing in the passage with snow on his shoulders and his hands shaking. She did not speak. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and between them stood 40 feet of stacked firewood, the structure he had called a coffin made of kindling, the structure he had tried to undermine with rumors and bad plans and rigged instruction sheets, the structure that had just saved his life the same way it had saved Bernt's and Tollef's and Clara's and 4 children whose parents had stood in his store and told him he was wrong. She took him inside, through the passage, 40 feet. He walked behind her, his boots on packed earth, the walls rising above him on both sides, the tin roof shedding snow in a sound like sand on metal. He could feel the wind dying as he moved deeper. By the midpoint, the air was calm. By the cabin end, it was warm. She sat him beside the stove. She gave him coffee, real coffee, the kind Arna had started bringing. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and set his gloves on the warming ledge to dry. Cresswell sat in Ragna's cabin and looked at the room. The pantry wall was covered in pencil marks, dates, temperatures, wood counts, storm durations. Marte's tally stick sat on the shelf beside the stove, notched with decades. Bernt's measurements, signed in his own hand, 40 feet confirmed, were pinned to the wall above the table. The room was small, spare, clean, and organized by a mind that measured everything and wasted nothing. He was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. The passage clicked outside, settling in the cold. "I sold wood by the cord for 20 years, Cresswell said. "I never knew what else it could buy." He stayed until the wind dropped. He did not apologize for the store credit, the cattle threats, the fire rumor, or the bad instruction sheets. Cresswell was not built for apology, but he released the most predatory clause in Pater's account, the one that gave him first right on the cattle the following week, in writing, delivered by the same freight driver who had brought the original probate letter 18 months before. He did it partly from shame. He did it mostly because the community was watching, and a storekeeper who is seen as the enemy of the woman whose walls save children does not keep his customers for long. The release was not forgiveness, it was arithmetic. Cresswell understood arithmetic better than anyone in the Judith Basin, and the numbers had changed. Ragna pinned the release letter to the wall beside Burnt's measurements. She did not celebrate. She fed the stove, checked the cattle, walked the passage, and went to bed. By the autumn of 1890, Ragna's ranch had 3 connected winter structures. The original passage ran from cabin to barn, 40 feet, 8 feet high, rebuilt with seasoned ash in the lower courses and fresh split pine above. A second corridor, shorter, ran from the barn to the calf shed she had built in the spring, 22 feet, 6 feet high, walled with slab wood too thin for the main passage, but dense enough to break the shed-to-barn wind. A third structure, an open-sided fuel bay, roofed with poles and brush, sheltered the next season's firewood against the barn's south wall, keeping it dry and accessible without exposure. The system was not large. It covered less than 100 feet of total distance, but every foot was protected, and every building on the claim could be reached from every other building without stepping into open wind. Arne Solheim moved his forge to the ranch in the spring of 1890. The decision was practical before it was romantic. He needed a location closer to the claims he served along the Basin Road. Ragna needed iron repair that she could not afford to hire out. The forge went up beside the barn, connected to the main passage by a 6-foot covered walkway that Arne built himself, his first attempt at a wood corridor, overseen by Ragna, who corrected his corner cribbing twice and his drainage tilt once before he got it right. They married in June of 1890 in a civil ceremony at the Utica courthouse. The ceremony took 8 minutes. The witnesses were Marit Haugland and Bernd Assen, which would have seemed impossible 18 months earlier and now seemed inevitable. The marriage was not the reward. It was not the end of the story. It was an expansion of labor, of capability, of the argument that had begun with a hinge and continued through tin pitch and rawhide loops and iron straps. They argued about the forge placement. They argued about whether the connecting walkway needed a tin roof or could manage with brush. They argued about how much iron the ranch could afford to use versus how much it needed. Every argument ended in a better design because neither of them confused disagreement with disrespect. Arne brought strength that Ragna lacked, the ability to lift ash rounds alone that she had needed Marte's help to move, the forge skills to repair broken tools instead of replacing them, the steady patience to work metal while Ragna worked wood. Ragna brought knowledge that Arne respected, the tally stick measurements, the chalk mark consumption system, the understanding of wind and mass that she had learned from her father and refined through Marte and proven through 2 winters of living inside her own design. He kept the forge. She kept the land books. The arrangement was not equal in the way that people who have never worked a ranch imagine equality. It was equal in the way that 2 people carrying different ends of the same log are equal. The load is shared, the balance is negotiated, and neither can drop their end without the other falling. Their first child was born in 1891, a daughter. Ragna delivered in the cabin with Marit attending, and Arne sat in the passage between cabin and barn because there was nowhere else to sit, and the passage was the only place on the ranch where a man could be near his wife without being in the way. He heard the crying through the cabin end flap and came inside with sawdust on his shirt and a face that had forgotten every argument he had ever won. The daughter grew up walking the passage the way other children walked hallways. She knew the walls by touch. She knew which courses were original and which had been replaced. She knew the sound of a good stack, the click of settling cold, and the sound of a bad one, and she could tell the difference before she could read. Years compressed. A second child, a son, born in 93. The herd grew to 22 head. Ragna sold milk, cream, and butter through a route that Merritt managed, splitting the revenue and the labor the way neighbors split it when trust has been earned through shared survival. Arna shod horses for half the basin and repaired tools for the other half. The ranch did not make them wealthy. It made them steady, which in the Judith Basin was the more durable achievement. Ragna taught through the 90s the way she had taught since the first churchyard lesson, in person, by hand, with the tally stick, and a willingness to ride to someone's claim and press their hand against the draft they had missed. By 1895, at least 9 families in the basin had built some version of the passage. Full corridors between house and barn, half corridors backed by earth banks, short calf runs inside barns, fuel bays connected to kitchens. Some used cordwood, some used slab wood, some used hayback timber walls where the conditions allowed, sheltered draws where wind was less severe and the risk of rot was manageable. The spread was not a revolution. It was not named or cataloged or written up in any manual that survives. It was frontier knowledge moving the way useful things move, by hand, by need, by one neighbor watching another survive and asking how. Ragna did not build corridors everywhere. She taught when not to build them. In sheltered timber, they were unnecessary. The trees did the work. In wet lowland, the bottom courses rotted too fast to maintain. On exposed benches where the wind crossed open ground between house and stock, they could mean life. The knowledge was specific. It was local. It was calibrated to a landscape that punished generalization and rewarded people who understood why a thing worked before they tried to build it. She never stopped correcting loose stacks. Well into her 60s, she would visit a neighboring claim and find a course that had shifted, or a foundation stone that had settled, and she would tap it with the edge of her boot until it sat right. The boot correction became her signature, a small, sharp kick at the base of a crooked course, delivered without comment, the way Marte had delivered lessons. Through the body, not the voice. Arna died in 1912 from a stroke at the forge. He was 58. He had been working on a set of sled runners, the same kind he and Ragna had first built together, and he fell beside the anvil with the hammer still in his hand. Ragna found him when she came through the connecting walkway with his noon meal. She sat beside him on the forge floor for a long time before she went for help. She did not rebuild the forge walkway after Arne died. She sealed the opening with stacked wood, a short, dense wall that closed the gap and became part of the passage system, fuel and barrier in one, the way everything on her ranch served 2 purposes, or did not serve at all. Ragna lived into her 70s. She died in 1931 in the same coolie, in the same cabin, with the original barn still standing, though the first passage was long gone, burned, restacked, burned again, replaced, and finally dismantled when the cabin was rebuilt with proper double walls that did not need external wind armor. The tally stick sat on a shelf in the new cabin, its notches dark with decades of handling, Marte's measurements still readable if you held it to the light. She was buried beside Peter in the small cemetery above Utica. Arne's grave was next to hers. The stone was plain. The dates were carved in the same hand that had carved the dates on 100 other stones in that cemetery. And if you did not know whose name it was, you would walk past it the way you walk past any stone that marks a life you never lived. By the early 1890s, 9 families in the Judith Basin had built some form of Ragna Brecka's protected passage. Some were cordwood, 40 feet long and 8 feet high. Some were slab wood and earth, half that length and backed by the ground. One was built from railroad ties by a section hand who had heard the measurements third hand and got the thickness right, but the drainage wrong, and who fixed it the following autumn after Ragna rode 12 miles to press his hand against the pooling water at the base and explain what it would become when it froze. The knowledge did not travel by publication or patent. It traveled by hand. Ragna's hand on Marit's hand on Clara Flatten's arm, Clara repeating the measurements to a neighbor who had asked why the school teacher trusted a wall more than a rope. Ragna Brecka remained in El Coolie. She kept cattle, milked through October, taught younger settlers that a stack is not measured only by how much heat it gives in the stove. It is measured by what it protects before the match is struck. She corrected loose stacks with the edge of her boot until her knees would not let her crouch, and then she corrected them with her voice, which was sharper and carried farther. On the morning of December 23rd, 1887, when the temperature dropped to 31 below zero and the wind buried the coolie in white, a cowboy outside Cresswell's store had called the passage a coffin made of kindling. The coffin was not the passage. The coffin was the open distance between buildings. 40 feet of exposed ground where the wind owned everything, and a rope was a thread against a river. The kindling became the wall. The wood was not waiting to save her later. It was saving her while it stood in the dark, taking the wind on its outer face, holding stillness on the inside, one dry stick at a time.